Hello, my name is Christoffer Nyborg, and I'm so excited to be here with you guys on the Norseman Endurance Science Seminar. I'm a medical doctor working off the section of vascular investigation in Oslo University Hospital with circulatory medicine, and also doing my PhD in extreme medicine with the University of Oslo. And I've been so lucky to be with the Norseman research teams the last year. This is the Norseman research team, at least some of us. I'm the guy with the long hair, did a haircut last year, so still me. It's been a great experience to research in this extreme event. So recently we published this article about biochemical markers or blood samples, basically, after the Norseman Xtreme Triathlon. And I'm basically going to run you through the main findings of our study. So, as you all know, swimming 3.8 kilometers in cold water, biking 180 kilometers through the Norwegian mountains, and then running a full marathon uphill at 42.2 kilometers does something with the human body and the human physiology, both the muscles, the cardiovascular system, and also the blood. Keeping in mind that the elevation these athletes climbing are at a total elevation about 5,000 meters, a little above that actually, during the race, gives an extreme load on the muscles and the cardiovascular system as well. So, the blood. So, why is the blood so interesting? Well, first of all, I would say there's two reasons. The first reason, we're curious. We're curious about how the human body handles the extreme or the outer edges of what it can achieve. So in the name of curiosity and knowing about the physiology of the human body when it do this kind of achievement as completing the Norseman, we're interested to see what's that's like. But also there's a clinical and a security perspective of this. And that's at the emergency room at the hospital or at your doctors, we use blood tests all the time to say something about illness and pathology. So we need to know what is normal. What is normal when you're climbing up the hills of Gausatoppen after completing this race? If you get ill there, if you get an accident, in a car accident, biking accident, or if you have any kind of other illness, how can we use these tools that we use to the blood samples in this kind of settings? So this is what sparked this project and caused us to take blood samples of these athletes at rest before the race, at finish line, and the day after to see what is this like. So this is what meets the daily clinician, so the doctor at the hospital when they take a blood test. This is the blood test we have taken in this project, which many of them are the regular ones that you would take at your doctor's at the checkup or at the emergency room. So these values, as you see here, pointed out as baseline, are basically the median values of all the samples we have taken. We've taken between 50 to 100 samples for each of these. And you see that all these baseline values are within the reference range for all these tests. So this is basically your healthy, normal athlete that we measured before start. But what we see when you cross the finish line is these samples. Several of these samples, when we run statistics on them, we see that there's are systematic changes in almost every sample. Let me highlight them for you. So all the bold samples here had statistic changes that we see, like most or all the athletes had these changes with the hemoglobin, which is the oxygen transporting agent in the blood or a cell. It had a slight decrease. White blood cell had an increase. Thrombocytes, which are the blood aggregating agent that stops bleeding, has a small increase. And the CRP, an acute phase protein that which the blood produces in reaction to inflammation or damage and so on, had a small increase. Natrium, one of the electrolytes, keeps stable. We see that kalium decreases, calcium increases somewhat, and so on. But not all of these are so interesting because they vary within the clinical normal range. So a doctor wouldn't really notice them coming in. the difference from the baseline and the finish, because like hemoglobin, both values are within the reference range. So that doesn't really tell you here's something damage or here's something that you should be aware of. But if you look closely at the reference range, some of these samples that I highlighted red here are worth noticing. They're like clinically increased. We would normally associate them with pathology in the emergency room. And the white blood cells are the first one that comes out at 12.7, which is highly elevated, like you would expect to see with a major infection, for example. The CRP is slightly increased, which says something also about infection and inflammation in the body. AST is also slightly increased, and CK is majorly increased, which are a debris from muscle cells. So it says something about muscle damage. And also we see this hormone NtproBNP, or like this proBNP is actually a hormone, but we measure NtproBNP to say something about the amount of proBNP in the body. And that's a hormone produced by the heart that says there's a lot of strain on the heart. So it tells the body, reduce the blood volume so the heart can do less. This is something we use when we evaluate heart failure. And this is above the clinical threshold where we suspect heart failure. This is one of that worth noticing. We also did a follow-up the day after, and all the bold ones are still statistically changed from the baseline, but we're focusing on the red ones still. The white blood cells decrease somewhat beyond normal level, but they're still elevated. We see that the CRP continues to increase the following day. And also we see that AST is continuing to increase this following day. That's also a marker about cell damage. It's an intracellular enzyme that has increased even further, so more cell debris. And we see that the CK, the muscle damage marker, is still high, and NtproBNP is still high, but has decreased somewhat. So what we did next is that we looked at these red marked ones here that are clinically increased, to see if there's any correlation between them, if they vary together, if the CK is increased, it's also the CRP or the white blood cells and so on. Then we have this image here, which is quite a lot to comprehend in 1 minute, but I'll take you through it. It says something about the correlations between here, CK and race time. So there's a positive correlation. So when CK, the muscle damage, increases with racing time. So the longer the athlete took to finish the race, or the longer it was out running, basically, the more damage CK would find in their blood. And the same with CRP, it's increased with race time. And also CRP and CK are increased with higher BMI. So the heavier the athlete are, the more damage and more inflammation. And also we see that AST and other cell damage marker is more increased with age. What's worth noticing here is NtproBNP is not correlated with any AST, CRP, or CK. We see that it's white here and it's white over here. So there's no correlation between that hormone and the other markers. The same goes for white blood cells. It's white down here. It doesn't correlate with the other markers. However, NtproBNP does decrease somewhat with increased weight, which is a subject for another day, just to explain what you see here. But what's interesting is this constellation down here. Is that CK, the muscle damage marker, CRP, the inflammation marker, and AST, the cell damage marker, are all correlated with each other. That means that the persons that have higher CRP also tend to have higher CK and AST. So the inflammation and the cell damage markers are correlated, while the white blood cells and the NtproBNP is elevated in other athletes. So they doesn't necessarily, they're not necessarily the same phenomenon. But let me take you through that. So If we first focus on CRP, the inflammation marker, AST, the cell damage marker, and creatine kinases, which are the muscle damage marker, we see that they all increased, and both CRP and AST continue to increase the following day. Creatine kinases is basically at the same level the following day. What we conclude from that, this is that when you run, and the further you run and the heavier you are, you have more cell damage in your muscles, basically, which is normal in exercise, but this is to a larger degree than we used to see. And with that increased damage, you see that the body sends out signals that, well, here's something going on. So it causes the liver to produce GRP, which is coming a little later in the course, because it takes some time to produce this protein. And this is, we see a high degree of cell damage and a high degree of inflammation. But keep in mind that all these athletes are healthy this coming day. So this is what the body is capable of handling. But this is much more than we see in other sorts of sports. And we also did tests after an Olympic marathon, Olympic triathlon, and these results are here. And we see the lines are basically flat. The CRP doesn't increase that much in a regular competition. The AST doesn't increase that much in a regular competition, and neither does creatine kinases. So this is something that happens when you push your body to the upper edge, but still, these athletes handle it. Also, a small note, you see the single highline here is the single individual, and he was all fine this coming day, the day after, just so you know. So let's go on to the next marker that I talked to you about, white blood cell counts. Well, white blood cells is this body's system of protection and cleaning up stuff. So what happens in Norseman, but also in the Olympic triathlon and basically all sports, is that when you start running and you start to use your body, the white blood cells are set free in the body. The body stores these white blood cells for cases of emergency and when to be ready in small venules, small vessels in the body. And when you start running, you both have an adrenaline rush, which mobilizes these cells, through hormonal regulation. And also just the blood flowing, increasing blood flow, mobilize these white blood cells. And this is something we see that basically happens in everyone. This is not a response. So what we conclude is this is not a response to damage. It's actually the body getting ready to take whatever is coming. Because you're active, you're out there, and the body knows that to some degree there's going to be some muscle damage. And these cells are there to clean up. So everyone basically has a increased white blood cell count after doing exercise, as you see here also in the Olympic. But about the clinical threshold levels, you see almost all the Norseman athletes get above that, or most of them. So in extreme triathlon, it's not based, and you're coming when you're in extreme triathlon, and you're coming to the emergency room because of an injury or something, you would expect to have a high white blood cell count. You don't have an infection, for example, which a clinician might think when you're coming in with these values. So this is somewhat more a general phenomenon. And also, lastly, we had this third phenomenon that was the NtproBNP. So this says something about heart failure, as I told you earlier on. It's a hormone that the heart produces when there's an increased strain on the heart, when it keeps working, and it's basically the tiredness of the heart muscle in itself. As you see, it's much higher than after the Olympic triathlon. So this is something we see with this extreme endurance event. What it tells us is that the heart has a lot to do, and the heart wants to reduce its load. Normally, the threshold for saying that a person has a heart failure at rest is 500. And you see a lot of the athletes actually are far above that. saying something about extreme load on the cardiovascular system. This is important to know since there are some rare occasions of something called swing-induced lung edema that happens during triathlon, where people get a brief heart failure that most people get by. So this is interesting news for us to see that the heart is, in most athletes actually are in a big, large strain. This gives a lot of information that we would like to work further on. And we notice this for the clinical perspective, so we're aware of it. But still, we do see some specific athlete diseases with this phenomenon. So this is something we're going to study more. But all of these athletes with these values came home safe and healthy. And you also see what's good, that these values decrease the day after. Heart had a lot to do on the finish line, but the body restitutes and everyone is getting better the day after. So that's the good news. So that was a brief tour around what we found when we looked at the biochemical markers of the Norseman Xtreme Triathlon. And I think this gives a lot of information to the clinicians monitoring the race and treating patients if there's any accidents and so on. And also it gives us a lot of insight in the physiology happening in the human body during such an event. And we're going to look further into some of these details. So I would thank you for your attention and enjoy the rest of the seminar. Thank you.